The hum of the generator outside was the only sound accompanying Amara as she lay on their wide king-size bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. The curtains fluttered slightly from the air conditioner, and the clock ticked toward midnight. Damien still hadn't come home. She glanced at her phone again, not to call, but to check the time as if it would explain his absence. A part of her wanted to believe he was stuck in traffic or caught up in business meetings, but deep down she knew better. These late nights had become the new normal. When he finally arrived around 12:43 a.m., his cologne mixed with tired sweat, she watched him quietly undress without saying a word. He didn't notice the food she had covered for him on the dining table. He didn't see the way her eyes followed him with a hunger that had nothing to do with desire, only a need to be seen. Damien lay beside her, scrolling through his phone, eyes lit by the blue glare of the screen. Amara shifted closer and gently placed her hand on his chest, tracing a soft circle with her fingers. "I miss you," she whispered, hoping he would hear the sorrow behind her words. But Damien sighed heavily and turned slightly. "I'm exhausted, Amara. Let's talk in the morning." There was no kiss, no warmth. She turned her back too, eyes wide open in the darkness. The bed felt colder with each inch between them. In the silence, Amara remembered the early days, their student apartment, shared meals on the floor, stolen kisses under broken ceiling fans. How had that love become this? The next morning, Damien was already gone before she awoke. The children were getting ready for school, their voices echoing faintly down the hallway. As she joined them for breakfast, Amara plastered on a smile for Chitty and Ada, masking the weariness in her bones. Damien had left no note, no goodbye. Her eyes darted to the untouched food on the table, now cold and stiff. Her appetite vanished. She watched her children eat while her heart gnawed at itself with quiet pain. Marriage, once a place of refuge, had become a hotel of strangers. And yet she stayed. Out of love? Habit? Fear? Even she didn't know any more. 2 weeks passed, but the pattern remained unchanged. Damien came home late and left early. He was always working, always in meetings. Amara began to notice how his once excited glances had turned neutral. He barely complimented her anymore. Even when she dressed in the red lingerie he once loved, he didn't notice. One night he came into the room early for a change, and she thought, maybe he wants me tonight. Her heart pounded with hope. He leaned closer, his hands sliding under her nightgown. But she flinched, not out of rejection, but pain. For so long she had been invisible, and now touched like a convenience. "I'm on my period," she lied, voice barely audible. Damien grunted and rolled over. They had started keeping score of rejections, of avoidance, of who hurt, who last. Amara stayed up that night, staring at his back. When did they start using excuses instead of affection? She wasn't angry, not entirely. She was disappointed. Disappointed that two people who once swore to be each other's everything had now become two ghosts haunting the same house. During breakfast, she didn't speak. Damien didn't either. He scrolled on his phone, sipping black coffee like it was the only thing he loved. Chitty asked a question about school, but neither parent heard him. The boy lowered his head and continued eating. Ada quietly played with her cereal. The silence was no longer awkward. It was home. Later that evening, Amara sat on the veranda watching the sky change color. Damien called to say he had a dinner meeting. She didn't bother asking where or with who. She simply said, "All right," and hung up. That night, she lay in bed alone again. This time she didn't even reach for his pillow. The sheets smelled like stale distance. She turned off the lamp and let darkness cover her body like a second skin. Her marriage was dying not because of infidelity, yet, but because of neglect. There was no affair to point to, just slow erosion, just the sound of silence, screaming louder than any betrayal ever could. Dinner at the Okafor household was now a mechanical ritual. The family sat together, but only the children spoke. Chitty would talk about a science experiment at school, and Ada would hum a song from her class play. But neither parent responded unless it was a distracted hum. Amara barely ate. Damien usually left his food half-touched, scrolling endlessly on his phone. Amara began to resent the glow of that device. It had become his new lover, his new source of joy. At night, she would overhear him chuckling to memes or chatting with business associates, and she'd wonder if he ever thought about her anymore, if he ever noticed her loneliness or the tear stains she wiped away before morning. The children weren't blind. One night, Chitty overheard a heated argument through the paper-thin walls. Amara had finally snapped and accused Damien of living like a ghost. He snapped back, calling her emotionally needy. Chitty held Ada close as she whimpered and whispered, "It's okay," even though it wasn't. At school, he started getting into fights. Teachers called Amara in, worried about his sudden aggression. She sat in the principal's office with a tight smile, promising to handle things at home, even though she knew she couldn't fix what she and Damien had broken. That night, she cried quietly in the bathroom, while Damien lay snoring in the next room, untouched by the storm. By the third month, the emotional distance had turned into physical space. Damien moved into the guest room, claiming he needed to focus on a major deal. Amara said nothing. She changed the sheets in their bedroom, cleaned his side of the closet, and made peace with sleeping alone. At church, they sat together for image's sake, but left in separate cars. Friends began to whisper. Neighbors noticed. The perfect billionaire marriage was fraying, and only the children still tried to stitch it together with drawings, hugs, and bedtime prayers. But even they were beginning to understand. Some things break too deeply to be fixed with love alone. Damien didn't ask why Amara no longer called to check on him. He didn't ask why she never waited up anymore. Truthfully, he didn't notice. His world was now a tight loop. Meetings, contracts, stock evaluations, and endless dinners with shallow conversations. He felt more alive in the boardroom than in his own home. He started avoiding coming home early, not because he was with another woman, yet, but because he felt suffocated by the unspoken tension in the house. The silence between him and Amara had begun to hum in the air like static electricity. Even when she passed him the salt during dinner, their fingers never brushed. There was no more good morning with warmth or how was your day with curiosity. They had become co-tenants, bound by a contract they once called love. Amara, on the other hand, was spiraling inward. She tried to find joy in motherhood, volunteering at Ada's school, helping Chitty with homework, preparing Damien's favorite meals, still clinging to some part of the woman she used to be. But it was all routine now. No appreciation. No spark. Sometimes she stood in front of the mirror and stared at her reflection, trying to remember what made Damien fall in love with her. Was it her smile? Her cooking? The way she used to challenge him when they were broke students and ambition was all they had? Now even her smile felt forced and her eyes looked tired. The only time she felt truly seen was when Ada would randomly hug her from behind and whisper, "Mommy, I love you." But even those hugs were becoming less frequent. The children were absorbing the cold tension and slowly building protective walls of their own. They now slept in different rooms, Damien in the guest room, Amara in the master. The excuse was always something practical. "I'm working late, you sleep early," or "I don't want to disturb you." At first, Amara tried to fight it. She left his favorite pajamas on the bed. She texted him things like "good night" or "miss you." But after weeks of no reply, she stopped. Damien, too, noticed the quiet, but convinced himself it was mutual. Neither one realized they were slipping into emotional divorce. Friends stopped visiting. The house grew quieter, colder. Even the family photos in the hallway began to feel like mocking ghosts. They weren't husband and wife anymore. They were two tired souls, haunted by the memory of what they once were. It began on a Saturday night. The children were at their cousin's house for the weekend. Amara sat alone in the dimly lit living room, flipping through channels, barely watching anything. The silence pressed against her chest like a weight. She poured herself a glass of wine, something she rarely did, and scrolled through her phone, looking at old pictures. A photo popped up of her and Damien at Tarqua Bay 5 years ago. They were laughing, windswept and sun-kissed. She stared at the image until her vision blurred, then locked her phone quickly. That was when an ad popped up, Feeling lonely? Connect anonymously and feel desired again. She scoffed at it, but didn't swipe it away. Something inside her stirred. What harm is there in talking? I won't do anything, she told herself. Hours later, she downloaded the app. Damien, on the same night, sat in his study, surrounded by spreadsheets and contract printouts, but couldn't focus. He opened Instagram and mindlessly scrolled past vacation pictures, couples dancing, engagement shoots. Then he opened Twitter. More chaos. More arguments. More emptiness. The loneliness was deafening. His hand hovered over his phone before typing discreet companionship into the search bar. The same app popped up. It claimed to connect like-minded professionals who didn't want strings, only escape. Damien hesitated. His conscience pricked at him. But it wasn't guilt about Amara. It was the fear of getting caught. But who would catch him? She barely looked at him these days. He downloaded it. Created a profile with no face, no real name. Let me just chat. No harm in that, he lied to himself. Both of them, in separate rooms, on the same night, began what they thought was a harmless escape. Amara's username was Quiet Soul. Damien's was Mr. Vision. They were matched after a short compatibility quiz, drawn to each other by shared answers. They didn't know it yet, but they were talking to each other. And for the first time in years, they laughed. They texted about music, old Nollywood films, annoying work habits. They flirted. Amara felt desired. Damien felt interesting. The irony was tragic. They rediscovered each other, without even knowing it, through the words they never said aloud anymore. It was digital betrayal, emotional infidelity. And yet it made them feel alive. Their online conversations grew bolder with each passing day. Amara began sleeping with her phone under her pillow, grinning like a teenager when messages from Mr. Vision popped up. Damien responded to her flirty emojis during meetings, occasionally stepping out to send a cheeky voice note. They shared fantasies, not too explicit at first, but laced with tension. Amara described how unseen she felt at home. Damien said he was tired of being the strong, silent type with no one to truly talk to. Both poured their hearts out, cloaked in anonymity. The irony of confessing to a stranger about the pain they caused each other at home was almost poetic. They both believed they'd found something refreshing, something new, something tempting. At night, Damien began retreating to his study just to message Quiet Soul. Amara stopped caring when he didn't come to bed. In fact, she preferred it. More freedom to text her mystery man. They set a rule. No real names, no photos. Just connection. Amara started laughing again. Damien started sleeping with a smile. The affair wasn't physical yet, but it was deeper in many ways. They shared versions of themselves that no longer existed in their real marriage. When Damien told her about a poem he once wrote in university, Amara's eyes filled with tears. He still remembers that, but she didn't connect the dots. And neither did he, when she described her fear of growing old in a house where love had died. They had fallen in love again, ironically, with the very person they were running from. The danger wasn't that they were cheating. The danger was that they were finding pieces of their spouse they'd discarded years ago, and didn't recognize it. The emotional affair was heating up. Damien began hinting at a meetup. Amara hesitated at first, but then agreed. The kids would be at summer camp soon. She needed something wild, something to remind her she was still alive. They scheduled a date, 1 week from now. A hotel suite in Lekki. Damien ordered champagne and petals. Amara bought a red veil and booked a waxing appointment. Both stood on the edge of a cliff they didn't even know they were circling each other on. Destiny was about to rip off the mask. The midnight hour became sacred in the Okafor mansion. Amara would lie on her side of the bed, eyes glued to her screen, fingers moving rapidly as she chatted with Mr. Vision. She would laugh, really laugh, for the first time in years. Damien would be in his study or out on the balcony, doing the same. Their chats had evolved from simple flirty lines to deeply personal confessions. They talked about favorite childhood meals, painful memories, their fears of becoming irrelevant. When Damien sent a voice note describing how he sometimes wished he could just leave everything behind and become invisible, Amara's heart ached. She felt that too. She typed, "Sometimes I wish I could be someone else, even just for a night." His reply came quickly. "Let's be that for each other. Just for one night." Neither of them had said anything explicitly sexual. But the tension was undeniable. They described fantasies that were more emotional than physical. Dancing in a dark room with someone who wanted only them, being kissed on the forehead after a long day, being looked at like they were the only person in the room. Ironically, these were all things they used to do for each other years ago, before kids, before wealth, before bitterness. Amara began planning her evenings around the chats. She bathed with care, moisturized like she was going out, and slipped into silk nightwear before lying down with her phone. Damien, too, started shaving more often, adding cologne before sleep, just in case she asked for a late-night video call. They never did, but the fantasy gave them butterflies. And both mistook those butterflies for signs of something new. Unknown to each other, they were not falling for strangers. They were falling for the ghost of their former marriage, repackaged in the anonymity of digital desire. Amara told Mr. Vision about her husband once, a vague, distant version, saying he had grown cold and silent. Damien responded, "He's a fool to not see what he has." The irony crushed her. Likewise, Damien mentioned that his wife used to be his best friend, but now she just coexisted beside him. Amara replied, "Maybe she's just waiting for you to see her again." These emotional exchanges danced dangerously close to exposure, but the masks held, for now. The more they poured into each other, the more they convinced themselves that this upcoming hookup was harmless, that it would be just one night, then closure. Neither of them knew that they were hurtling toward a moment that would implode everything they'd built. Amara stood in front of the mirror in her room, holding up different dresses. She hadn't felt this flutter of anticipation in years. Even when preparing for social events, she usually dressed with calculated elegance. But this felt different. This felt personal. She chose a deep red gown with a flowing slit, something she'd never wear to church or school meetings. She sprayed her perfume carefully. 2 spritzes behind the ears, 1 at the base of her neck. For the first time in forever, she felt seen. Not by Damien, not even by this mystery man, but by herself. She had forgotten this version of Amara, the woman who once danced barefoot in their university dorm room, who once felt beautiful without needing approval. And somehow, tonight, she was that girl again. Damien, in his separate wing, sat by the edge of his bed with a glass of wine, scrolling through playlists. He wanted something romantic, something to set the mood. He didn't want loud music or synthetic beats. He wanted soft, soulful jazz. He selected a playlist and let the first notes hum through his Bluetooth speaker. The hotel had already confirmed the rose petals, the chilled champagne, the room temperature set just right. He checked the text one last time. 7 p.m. where something read, "I want to be surprised." She had responded with a single red heart. It was ironic. He had never planned such a romantic setup for Amara in years. He'd forgotten what it meant to curate an experience just to impress someone. Somewhere in his mind, he thought, if only my wife had made me feel like this again, never realizing it was her all along. As the day approached, both felt consumed by the impending meetup. Amara told her sister she would be attending a charity gala. Damien told his assistant to cancel all meetings past 5 p.m. Neither of them could focus. Even Chitty noticed something different when Damien hugged him before school, something he hadn't done in months. Ada complimented her mother's glowing skin, asking, "Mommy, why do you look so happy?" Amara kissed her gently and said, "No reason, baby." Inside, however, she was torn between guilt and excitement. "I deserve this," she told herself. "Even if it's just once." Damien echoed the same lie in his head. They were preparing to cheat, to step outside their vows. But because their partner had drifted so far from who they once loved, they felt justified. The emotional lines had already been crossed. The physical was just a formality now. The day before the meetup, Amara found herself unusually nervous. Every moment felt surreal. She cleaned the house with more enthusiasm than usual, smiled a little more at the gatekeeper, and even chatted briefly with Ada's teacher during school pickup. It wasn't joy, at least not the pure kind. It was the giddy guilt of someone running from their life and toward a fantasy. Her gown was packed in a discreet black box. Her makeup kit was arranged with military precision. She'd booked a cab that wouldn't alert the family driver. Everything had to be clean, quiet, untraceable. The lie she told her sister was airtight, an overnight conference. But what she didn't realize was that her hands were trembling slightly each time she touched her phone. This wasn't just about excitement. This was fear. Somewhere deep inside her, a voice whispered, "If you go through with this, there's no going back." Damien was just as tightly wound. He had held board meetings without focus, skipped lunch entirely, and even canceled his usual gym session. He was consumed by a strange mix of hunger and dread. He kept checking his messages. She hadn't canceled. She hadn't backed out. He told himself that this would be one night, one release. That no one would get hurt. That he'd return to work the next day with a clearer head. But that was a lie he'd repeated so often, he didn't even notice it anymore. What he truly craved wasn't sex, it was validation. He wanted someone to look at him and see the man he used to be. Not just a billionaire CEO, not just a father or a provider, but a man who once made someone's heart race. He thought Quiet Soul was his chance to feel that again. They texted throughout the day. "I'll be wearing red," she reminded him. "I'll be waiting," he responded. Both deleted their messages immediately after. Both hid the rising tension from their children. The kids sensed it though, an unspoken electricity in the air. That evening, Amara left first, wearing a long coat over her dress. Damien left an hour later, dressed sharply in a black silk shirt and gray slacks. He smelled of oud and anticipation. The hotel was quiet, luxurious, candlelit. Room 1407. The petals were in place. The champagne was chilled. The playlist began to play softly. He stood facing the door, waiting. Moments later, there was a knock. His heart pounded. Slowly, he opened the door. There she stood, veiled, red gown, silhouette glowing under the hallway lights. He smiled and stepped back, gesturing her in. She stepped in, turned to face him, lifted her veil, and time stopped. The moment Amara lifted her veil, Damien's smile froze mid-expression. For a few agonizing seconds, neither of them spoke. The music faded into the background as silence roared louder than any argument ever could. Their eyes locked, filled with disbelief, shame, and unbearable realization. Damien's jaw tensed, his breath shallow. Amara's lips trembled, her heart galloping against her chest. She looked down at herself, in the red dress she picked for someone else, standing in front of her own husband like a stranger. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Damien stepped back, hands clenched, eyes dark with a cocktail of confusion and accusation. "You," he finally said, his voice hoarse. Amara took a step backward, her body trembling. "You were Mr. Vision." Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. The irony stung sharper than betrayal. It wasn't just that they were cheating. It was with each other. The weight of the moment dropped like thunder between them. Damien's expression twisted, first in disbelief, then anger. "You've been cheating on me," he snapped. Amara's head shot up, eyes wide with shock. "You're accusing me? You were on the same damn app." Her voice, usually calm, came out with fire. Years of bottled-up silence erupted in seconds. "So you've been talking to someone behind my back?" he continued, pacing the room. Amara laughed bitterly. "You mean the way you sleep in another room and call it business? You haven't touched me in months." Her voice cracked as tears filled her eyes. "I wanted to feel seen again, desired, like I wasn't just a shadow in my own home." Damien's anger clashed with shame, his voice rising as he accused her of being unfaithful. She screamed back, "You were doing the same thing." But in their hearts, neither believed it was the first time. Trust had already been on life support. This just pulled the plug. Eventually, the shouting subsided. There were no more words to throw, no more accusations to hurl. Damien sank into a chair, defeated. Amara stood stiff, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "So this is who we are now," she whispered. "We have to sneak around just to talk to each other." Damien didn't respond. He couldn't. His pride was bleeding. So was hers. The dream of feeling new again had shattered into something uglier than either of them imagined. There was no intimacy left in that hotel suite. Only two broken people standing in the ruins of their marriage. The silence returned, but this time it was final. Damien grabbed his jacket. Amara turned away. He walked out without looking back. She stayed behind for a while, staring at the champagne bottle they never opened. When she finally left, her makeup had streaked down her face, but her spine was straight. The night that was supposed to awaken them had destroyed what was left. The following morning began like any other, but everything had changed. Damien didn't come home. Amara didn't ask where he was. She spent the entire day in her room, replaying every moment of the night before, trying to piece together how far they had truly fallen. At lunch, Ada asked, "Mommy, are you sick?" Amara smiled faintly and shook her head. Chitty observed quietly, noticing how puffy her eyes looked, how distant she seemed. That night, when Damien finally walked through the door around 11 p.m., he didn't speak. Amara, seated in the living room, looked up with quiet rage. "So you're not even going to ask me how I got home?" she asked. Damien didn't respond. Instead, he removed his shoes, loosened his collar, and poured himself a drink like he was alone. That silence, casual, cold, was more painful than any fight. But the fight eventually came. Hours later, the house erupted with voices. Amara accused Damien of emotional abandonment. "You stopped loving me long ago," she cried. "You made me beg for attention like a stranger." Damien, wounded and defensive, fired back. "And what? That justifies cheating." Amara's voice broke. "You were cheating too, Damien." But he deflected, too proud to admit fault. "You dressed up for another man, booked a hotel, and lied to your own children." The words stung. Amara retaliated with venom. "You made me feel like I was dying inside my own house." "I tried, Damien. God knows I tried." They shouted until their voices cracked, until the children knocked on the door with trembling hands, asking them to stop. But even that wasn't enough to restore calm. Something irreversible had broken. The days that followed were filled with silent dinners, passive-aggressive glances, and subtle acts of war. Damien locked himself in his study. Amara cried silently in the bathroom, both too stubborn to apologize, too wounded to offer peace. The emotional wounds festered, infecting every part of their home. The children began to notice. Chitty grew quiet. Ada stopped drawing happy family portraits at school. Friends began to whisper. Staff members walked on eggshells. The mansion that once symbolized success now echoed with a quiet horror of a dying union. And the worst part? Neither of them could prove they were truly betrayed, because both had crossed the same line. The affair wasn't with someone else. It was with a version of each other they no longer recognized. It was Amara who made the first move. After a particularly cold breakfast, where Damien didn't even look up from his phone, she stood up and said calmly, "I'm leaving." He blinked, slowly lifting his gaze. "What do you mean?" She stared at him, exhausted and empty. "I mean, I can't do this anymore. The silence, the fights, the lies." He scoffed. "So you're running away?" She didn't answer. She went upstairs, packed a small suitcase, and called her sister. Chitty and Ada watched from the hallway, unsure of what to do or say. When Amara came back down, she crouched to hug them. "I'll see you soon, okay?" Her voice broke. Ada clung to her. Chitty simply said, "Don't go." Amara kissed them and walked out. Damien watched from behind the curtain, but he didn't stop her. Not because he didn't care, but because his pride chained him still. That evening, the house was painfully quiet. Damien walked from room to room, noting her absence in subtle ways. The missing slippers, the unlit scented candles, the silence in the kitchen. He poured himself a drink and sat in the dining room, staring at her untouched seat. For the first time in years, the silence felt deafening. No one was there to nag him. No one was there to judge his coldness. And yet, he felt lonelier than ever. He picked up his phone and hovered over her contact but didn't dial. Let her stay mad, he told himself. She left. But deep down, guilt clawed at his chest. He had driven her away, one rejection at a time, one silence at a time. He turned on the TV, but nothing could drown out the echo of her absence. Outside, the story had already begun to leak. Damien was a public figure, a billionaire CEO with media attention. Whispers began to spread in Lagos social circles. Did you hear? Amara left the house. Blogs speculated about infidelity. Former friends of Amara reached out with cautious sympathy. Her sister tried to protect her from the noise, but Amara had already seen the headlines. She lay awake at night, scrolling through articles with shaking hands. The comments were brutal. Some blamed her. Others painted her a victim. But none of them knew the truth, that both she and Damien were guilty. That pride, silence, and digital masks had turned their love into rubble. And now she was standing alone in the ruins. The first week after Amara left was chaos behind a polished front. Damien still wore his suits, still appeared on magazine covers, still hosted high-profile meetings. But at home, the silence was heavier than ever. The children, once protected by the illusion of their parents' unity, were now fully exposed to the truth. Chitty, who had always been a quiet and thoughtful boy, became moody and withdrawn. His grades slipped. His teacher called home twice, concerned that he had started sleeping in class and snapping at his peers. Damien responded to the calls with forced concern, promising to talk to his son. But he didn't. Instead, he buried himself in work, convincing himself that as long as he paid for the best schools and the best doctors, everything else would sort itself out. Ada, sweet and gentle, reacted differently. She clung more tightly to her nanny, cried at night, and constantly asked when Mommy was coming home. Damien wasn't equipped to answer. He tried once, awkwardly saying, "She's resting for now, baby. You'll see her soon." But Ada saw through it. She had heard the shouting. She had seen her mother walk out of the door with tears in her eyes. She had heard the silence of goodbye. The absence of her mother's soft kisses before bed left a hollow in her young heart. At school, she drew pictures of broken houses, a small girl in the middle with a tear on her face. Her teacher, disturbed by the emotional shift, sent a note home. Damien read it, sighed, and placed it inside his drawer, unread in meaning. Chitty, on the other hand, turned his pain into anger. One afternoon, after school, he punched another boy in the face for teasing him about his billionaire dad who can't even keep his wife. When Damien was called to the school, he showed up with sunglasses and a blazer, but no words for his son. The principal waited for him to speak. Damien simply said, "We'll handle it at home." But at home, he said nothing. He simply told Chitty, "You can't do things like that," and retreated into his study. Chitty stared at the closed door with trembling fists. That night, he cried quietly into his pillow, feeling more alone than ever. The parents had chosen silence and separation. But the children, they inherited the debris of the war. 2 weeks into the separation, Amara received a letter from Damien's lawyer requesting an amicable meeting to discuss the terms of their separation and potential divorce. She read the letter twice, her hands trembling slightly. So he wanted to end it formally now. No phone call, no personal conversation, just lawyers. She stared at the ceiling of her sister's guest room, letting the betrayal soak in fully. Her sister, Ngozi, tried to be supportive, but even she was beginning to show signs of fatigue. "You should talk to him," she offered gently, "at least for the sake of the children." But Amara shook her head. "He wants peace through paperwork, not understanding." She didn't respond to the letter immediately. She needed time, but time only deepened the ache. Meanwhile, Damien met with his lawyer, Barrister Collins, a sharp-tongued man who had handled celebrity divorces and asset shielding for years. "We need to protect your investments," Collins said bluntly. "Don't offer spousal support unless absolutely necessary. She has her family. Let's keep this clean." Damien nodded without much resistance. The meetings were clinical, cold. Damien didn't even argue over custody. He assumed Amara would want the kids. He thought she always did. But Collins warned him, "You must at least contest joint custody. It looks bad if you don't." Damien didn't care for the optics. In truth, he had started avoiding the children. Their eyes reminded him of Amara. Their silence was too familiar. His guilt gnawed at him in quiet moments, but he wore detachment like a suit. Amara finally responded, through her own lawyer. The tone was equally cold, though beneath the surface, her heart bled. They began exchanging documents. Properties, cars, joint accounts, business holdings, the house in Ikoyi, even the wedding gifts that were still in storage. Nothing was sacred anymore, not the memories, not the laughter, not the vows. Just paperwork. Legal jargon replacing "I love you." Mediation sessions were scheduled. None of them looked each other in the eye. Even in those stiff conference rooms, the tension was unbearable. One time, Damien glanced at her hand, still bare, the wedding ring gone. His chest tightened, but his face remained stone. Amara saw him look. She saw the regret in his eyes. But she looked away. It was too late for longing. They were no longer husband and wife. They were case numbers. And their love was now an asset to be divided. The nights were the hardest for both of them. Damien, who once fell asleep within minutes of his head touching the pillow, now lay awake in his massive, quiet bedroom. The shadows on the wall looked like memories. He found himself scrolling through old pictures, vacations, anniversaries, birthday cakes. There was one of Amara in a yellow dress, laughing on a swing. He stared at it until tears welled in his eyes. He had forgotten how beautiful her laugh was, how much peace it brought him in his youth. Now, all he had was silence, cold sheets, and an empty house. The staff moved quietly these days. The kids barely spoke. He had everything money could buy, but nothing that made him feel human. For the first time in a long while, Damien wondered if this loneliness was the price of his ego. Amara wasn't faring better. Her nights were filled with phantom touches, with flashes of memories she couldn't erase. She missed the weight of Damien beside her, the sound of his morning voice, the way he used to call her Nkem when no one else was listening. She had her pride, yes, but it was no longer a shield. It had become a coffin. Each night she sat by the window in her sister's house, staring at the sky, wondering if Damien ever thought about her, wondering if he regretted any of it. She didn't know how to move on. Every man who tried to talk to her reminded her of what she had lost. Not the title of being a billionaire's wife, but the love of the boy who once ran barefoot with her under rainstorms in Succa. That boy was gone, and she didn't know when she had buried him. Neither of them reached out, but both wanted to. Every time Damien typed her number, he deleted it before dialing. Every time Amara saw his name trending online, she ached to call. But they were both prisoners of pride. The world thought they were moving on. The tabloids wrote about Damien's business deals and Amara's charitable work. But the truth was simpler. They were two wounded lovers, curled in opposite corners of a battlefield, bleeding in silence. Neither of them had started seeing anyone else. Not seriously. Because how do you date someone new when your heart still belongs to the one who broke it? Their nights were filled with what-ifs. And in those lonely hours, they each whispered apologies to the dark, never heard, never sent. Just fragments of regret floating in silence. 3 years had passed since Amara walked out of the mansion in Ikoyi. 3 years since Damien watched her disappear into the darkness without trying to stop her. Time moved forward, but for both of them, healing had been partial at best. Damien's empire had doubled in size. He opened new branches across Abuja, Port Harcourt, and even Ghana. Headlines praised his focus and brilliance. Nigeria's quiet powerhouse, one magazine called him. But no amount of money could silence the emptiness that greeted him each night. His mansion was now spotless, organized, and dead. The warmth was gone. The walls echoed. He often ate dinner alone, sometimes with music playing softly in the background to fill the void. On his birthday, the staff sang. But when he blew out the candles, he wished for something no one could buy: his family. Amara had moved to a quieter estate in Bagada, close to her sister. She had built a name for herself in community outreach and girl-child education programs, earning respect for her grace and composure. publicly she was fine. She smiled at events, gave heartfelt speeches, and dressed elegantly. But when she returned home, it was just her, the kids, and the haunting rhythm of routine. Chitty was now 13, his voice deeper, his eyes colder. Ada, now 10, had grown quieter, more inward. Though Amara tried to fill the space Damien left, there were days she'd catch Chitty staring blankly at the front door like he was waiting for someone. Ada once asked quietly, "Why don't we have dinner like we used to?" Amara didn't have an answer. The truth was, the fracture between her and Damien had created fault lines that rippled into every part of their children's lives. Communication between Amara and Damien was minimal and mechanical. School fees, medical updates, holiday custody, all discussed via email or lawyers. They hadn't spoken on the phone in nearly a year. Damien saw the kids during scheduled weekends, and even those became increasingly rare. His guilt made him spoil them with gifts, but Chitty began refusing them. "I don't need a new phone. I need my dad." Ada was more forgiving, but even her smiles seemed practiced now. One evening, Damien scrolled through photos on his phone, pausing on a picture of Chitty blowing out candles on his 8th birthday, back when the family was still whole. He stared at it for a long time, thumb hovering over the call button for Amara. But then he locked the phone. He still couldn't bring himself to dial. Time had passed, but time had not healed them. It had only taught them how to pretend. It started small, comments Chitty would make at the dinner table. "It must be nice to love someone and still leave them." Or, "You two cared more about your pride than us." Amara tried to talk to him gently, but every conversation turned into confrontation. "You think I don't remember the shouting? The nights you both ignored each other? You think I didn't hear the door slam the night you left?" he snapped one evening, standing over his unfinished food. Ada sat beside him, blinking back tears, her hands clenched on her lap. Amara stood frozen, unable to explain the complexities of adult pain to a boy who had grown up too fast. Chitty's anger wasn't just teenage angst, it was the residue of abandonment. He felt cheated, not just by the divorce, but by the silence that followed. Damien didn't fare any better. During one of the rare weekends Chitty spent with him, he tried to take the boy to a football match. Chitty refused to get in the car. "You think throwing money at everything makes you a father?" he snapped. Damien tried to laugh it off, but Chitty's glare was cold. "You stopped being my dad the day you let Mom walk out that door." Damien was stunned into silence. It was the first time his son had spoken directly about the separation. He wanted to explain, to defend himself, to say he'd been hurting too, but the words fell hollow. He had failed, and no justification could erase that. That night, Damien sat alone in his home office, staring at a bottle of wine he didn't touch. He replayed Chitty's words again and again. For the first time in years, he admitted something to himself. "I should have fought for them." Ada, though quieter, began to withdraw emotionally. At school, she stopped participating in art classes. Her drawings, once filled with color and joy, now featured broken lines, gray clouds, and distant houses. Her teacher, concerned, sent a report home. Amara read it and cried. One night, Ada asked in a whisper, "Did Daddy ever really love us?" The question cut Amara deeper than a blade. She hugged her daughter tightly, but couldn't answer immediately. In trying to protect the children from witnessing more fights, they had created a home filled with gaps, ghosts, and questions. That night, Amara called Damien, but hung up after 2 rings. She didn't know what she'd even say. Neither of them realized that their silence, once a self-defense mechanism, had now grown teeth. And it had bitten their children the hardest. One rainy Saturday morning, Amara sat on the veranda, watching droplets fall steadily onto the pavement. The air was thick with nostalgia. Ada was at her cousin's birthday party, and Chitty had locked himself in his room again. Amara held an old photo album on her lap, the one she hadn't touched in years. She opened it slowly, page by page. There was one from their university days. She and Damien sitting under a mango tree, arms around each other, laughing. She remembered the day. He had just written a poem for her, silly, beautiful, and off-key. Back then, love didn't need filters. They had dreams and shared wallets, and kissed in public, without shame. Now, they couldn't even share a conversation. She pressed her hand over the photo, tears welling up in her eyes. "How did we lose all that?" she whispered. Across town, Damien was in his home office, digging through old storage for a contract file, when he stumbled upon a shoebox. Inside were mementos: a dried flower from Amara's graduation bouquet, a scribbled note she had left in his lunch bag on their 3rd anniversary, a photo of her cradling baby Chitty. Damien sat down on the carpeted floor, overcome by a wave of longing. He held the note and read her handwriting, soft cursive, playful. "No matter how busy we get, let's never stop choosing each other." The words felt like a slap. "We stopped choosing," he muttered to himself. For all his success, all his logic, all his pride, he had lost the only thing that ever truly made him feel alive. And now, even the kids looked at him like a stranger. Both of them, alone in different houses, were mourning the same thing, not just the love they lost, but the people they used to be. Amara missed the girl who believed in forever. Damien missed the boy who used to dance with her in the kitchen, barefoot and broke, but happy. The bitterness had softened slightly with time, but regret had taken its place. That evening, they both unknowingly sat by their windows at the same time, watching the rain. Amara held a mug of tea. Damien held a glass of whiskey. Neither drank. Both stared out, thinking the same question. Did we destroy something that could have been saved? And for the first time in years, they both wished they had just talked, really talked, before letting silence steal everything. It was a high-profile investment summit in Victoria Island, a gathering of the nation's top billionaires, foreign investors, and economic influencers. Damien, as expected, was scheduled to speak on a panel about sustainable African tech infrastructure. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. Between trying to hold together his deteriorating bond with the children and the increasing emptiness in his life, he'd been running on fumes. His assistant noticed he looked pale, but Damien waved off concern. "I'm fine," he muttered. He had repeated that phrase so often over the years it had become muscle memory. The room was large, glamorous, filled with chandeliers and murmurs of power. As Damien walked up to the stage, gripping the edge of the podium, the world tilted sharply. He tried to steady himself, blinked twice, then fell. Gasps filled the hall. People leapt to their feet. Some shouted. Cameras flashed. For a terrifying moment, it looked like he wasn't breathing. His body lay slumped, motionless, eyes rolled back. The MC called for help. A doctor in the crowd rushed forward. And then, out of the crowd, pushing past frozen onlookers, came a woman in a deep blue dress, Amara. She had been at the event to represent her NGO, unaware Damien was also a speaker. But the moment she heard his name and saw his body collapse, instinct took over. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands trembling. Damien, look at me," she whispered. She cradled his head, her voice cracking with urgency. "Don't do this, please." For the first time in years, her hand was on his face, not out of anger, but love. Paramedics arrived. The crowd was asked to clear the room. As they prepared to lift him onto the stretcher, Damien's eyelids fluttered open weakly. His vision was blurry, but Amara's face came into focus. And in that fragile moment, the years peeled away. He didn't see the woman who left. He didn't see the partner he hurt. He saw the girl who used to wait for him after lectures, holding Puff Puff in a paper bag. The one who wrote his name with hearts around it. "Amara," he murmured. She nodded, eyes brimming. "I'm here." And just before he slipped into unconsciousness again, Damien whispered, "I never stopped." The rest was swallowed by silence as he was wheeled out. But Amara knew what he meant. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something stir that had been buried deep, something like hope. Damien spent 2 nights in the hospital under observation. The diagnosis was stress-induced collapse, bordering on burnout. The doctors warned him he had been running on adrenaline and pride, and that something worse could have happened. Amara stayed. She slept on the tiny visitor couch beside his bed, watching him breathe. The nurses whispered about her. Some recognized her, but she didn't care. When he opened his eyes again, she was there, holding a flask of pepper soup she had asked her sister to bring. He blinked slowly, the memory of her face at the summit flashing again. "You stayed," he said. His voice was rough. She nodded quietly. "I never stopped caring. I just couldn't find the words anymore." Their eyes met. Years of silence began to crack open. They didn't talk about reconciliation that night. They didn't talk about the divorce, or the children, or the pain. They simply talked. About books. About Chitty's football. About Ada's art. About the way the hospital food reminded Damien of NYSC camp. They laughed, gently, cautiously, like people rediscovering language. And when Damien finally said, "I failed you," Amara responded, "I failed us." There were no grand declarations. No dramatic kisses. Just honesty. Just quiet. Later that week, when Chitty and Ada came to visit and saw their parents sitting side by side on the hospital bed, something shifted. Chitty didn't roll his eyes. He simply nodded. Ada smiled. It wasn't full trust yet, but it was something. A crack in the ice. Weeks later, Damien returned home, not to the Ikoyi mansion, but to Amara's house in Bagada, where he stayed for a while. They attended therapy. They went on long walks. Sometimes they still argued, but now they listened. Chitty didn't speak to his father for a week, but eventually came around after an emotional apology. Ada painted a new portrait of their family, not perfect, but whole. The story doesn't end with wedding bells or renewed vows. It ends with a choice. Two people who broke each other finally choosing to rebuild. Slowly, deliberately, every day they chose again, despite the past, despite the pain. Because sometimes love doesn't come back through flowers or grand speeches. Sometimes it returns in a hospital bed with whispered words and shaky hands and the will to try again. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.